but they can just join in whenever so we can stay on track. But I'm Brittany Candioto. This is our SWSA group. This is our second meeting, and we wanted to do domestic violence this month since October is Domestic Violence Awareness. We have two speakers today to kind of give us a little insight on what they do in this area. So if you want to learn who we are, Brittany, currently the president. Then we have Jenna, our vice president. We have Christiane and Alyssa. Alyssa, I think you're frozen. Okay, there you are. Okay, anyway, so we have two speakers, and I will go ahead and let Jenna introduce her. So if you want to introduce your speaker.
So my speaker is currently having a hard time joining. So she emailed me some information, so I'm just going to read that. I don't know what else to do. So the lady who is going to speak is a social worker, and her background is in mental health and victim advocacy. She works for OU in the Gender Inequality Center and as the OU Advocates case manager. So essentially, she runs the OU Advocates program, including supervising the advocate volunteers, handling referrals and support for victims, supporting secondary victims. So the people who are probably helping the victims in the first place, and training advocates. OU Advocates is a program available to all OU campuses, and there's an advocate available at each campus. The one at OU Tulsa is Lauren Condry. She works in student affairs. And there's a helpline number, which I'll put in the chat. Each campus deals with slightly different issues, as each campus has unique student populations. The woman who is supposed to be speaking today works at the Norman campus, and at the Norman campus, she primarily deals with sexual assault and stalking. In Tulsa and health sciences, primarily domestic violence and relationship violence and stalking are what they work on at OU Tulsa. As social workers, I'd encourage you seek training for sexual assault and domestic violence issues. You'll come across these issues in all areas of social work. That's all she has. And she's tried to join. I don't know what to tell you guys. I'm sorry. Zoom issues, am I right? I'm going to try and email her a little bit more so we can maybe get her on, but that's the little spiel she gave me.
Okay, we can go ahead and let the next one speak. Is she here, Alyssa?
Yes. Okay, so we have Jessica Brown. She is a case manager at the Spring for the past 4 years. She is also on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at the Spring, and she is a recent grad from ORU, whoop, whoop, and professional counseling, and she's awesome. She's beautiful, and I love what their agency does out in Sand Springs for women. So I'm going to let her tell you what they do.
Hey, do you want me to go ahead and get started, or did our other speaker come on? Not yet? Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, can someone allow me to share my screen? That would be great.
I'll do so now.
Okay. Oh, and still not letting me do it.
Right now.
Okay. Yay, awesome. Okay. So okay, can everyone see my screen? Awesome. Okay, welcome to 2020, where we have to deal with technology like this. Okay, so like Alyssa said, my name is Jessica. I've been at the Spring, which formerly was Day Spring. So you may have heard of us before, but we, as of a couple of weeks ago, just went through a name change. So we're trying to get that out into the community. As a case manager, what my role looks like is, just to clarify, so there's a state certified case management role. At the Spring, case manager is just merely a title. I don't have that certification, but I did get my master's in professional counseling, and in my role as a case manager, I am responsible for helping provide resources to the guests that come in to the shelter and helping them get reestablished back into the community. Currently, we have 3 case managers, and then we have a whole team of guest advocates. They are our amazing frontline staff and help address more of the crisis and immediate needs of our guests on a day-to-day basis. Our shelter is open 24/7. We take crisis calls 24/7. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the presentation and give y'all some resources for other agencies in the area that also work with domestic violence. And so is everyone, I can't see everyone's little screen, but are we all social work students currently? I'm seeing head nods. Yes, all head nods.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. So hopefully my goal was to not only give a general idea of what domestic violence is, but to give you guys some really practical takeaways that hopefully can be useful to you guys out in the field as you are actually practicing in social work. And I think people are in the chat probably saying, yes, we are social work students. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. What we do is, as the Spring, we provide physical, emotional, Christ-like care to enable adults and their children to live God-honoring lives. And we do this by offering spiritual guidance, crisis care and counseling, professional services, safety, outreaches, and non-residential support. So we are the only faith-based shelter in the state of Oklahoma, but there are 2 that are certified to work with domestic violence and sex trafficking. The other is domestic violence intervention services. They're about 12 minutes away from us. So we do the same work. The main difference is that we're faith-based, and we have the opportunity to do that, like I said, through spiritual guidance. We offer Bible studies, and then afford the opportunity to the ladies to get to go to church on Sundays if they would like. And we provide them all the other resources for their basic needs as well. And not to assume, I like giving definitions. And so what is domestic violence? It is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain control over another intimate partner. So the reason for general terms and not specifics is that domestic violence isn't limited to romantic relationships. We have had guests at our shelter come in and their mom might have been their abuser, or their grandmother, or possibly a friend even that they were living with for an extended period of time. So an intimate partner is just dependent upon the relationship as identified by the survivor that we're working with. Let's go to the next slide. How abuse may appear. In the 1980s, a team from Duluth, Minnesota interviewed hundreds of battered women, and the power and control wheel is a culmination of the most common abuse tactics that these women experienced. So I like to talk about the fact that in this study, it's very biased in that it was focused primarily on interviewing women who'd experienced abuse. However, over years of research and reviewing these characteristics of domestic violence, they're still prevalent in other relationships, including in the LGBTQ community. So I wanted to emphasize that point, in that even though the interviews were geared toward women, they're still prevalent across any and all abusive relationships. And I made a bigger version, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to read. But these are the different characteristics based on those interviews and that study of domestic violence. Very rarely, if ever at all, is domestic violence characteristic of only one piece of this pie. Typically, there's going to be at least 2 or more, if not all of them involved. And they center around the abuser's desire to maintain power and control. That may look like a number of different things. So for example, I'm currently working with the guest who her primary forms of abuse were actually economic and emotional. She did not experience physical abuse in her situation. She does have a child, and part of this was also influenced by the fact that she is not a US citizen. So that was used against her as a means of perpetuating the abuse. These characteristics on the power and control wheel play out in what's going to be on this next screen in the cycle of abuse. How this typically plays out is there's an incident that takes place where the abuse is occurring. And then after that, there's what we might call the making up or the honeymoon phase, where the abuser may apologize, make promises, I'll never hurt you again, providing gifts to make up for what happened. And then there's a period of calm, which is a false sense of calm. It's really the calm before the storm, because this is where we might start getting our guests that have come in, they're starting to question whether or not another situation is about to take place. And then the tension begins to build, and then it leads to another incident. We typically get our intake calls at any of these last three stages between that calm, tension building, and another incident taking place. And when we receive those calls, we always do safety planning with the callers that are coming in, because in the event that they can't leave their situation immediately, we still want to make sure that they are safe in their situation despite the abuse that they might be experiencing. Also, to give a little insight on what a typical intake process looks like, not only at the spring, but really at any shelter that you call. The most important thing is that the victim themselves is the one making the call. There's no problem with having an advocate on the phone with them, but the reason we need to talk to them directly is because it shows that they are actually ready, even in the smallest capacity, to leave their situation. If someone is making a call on their behalf, we can't guarantee that that individual is actually taking steps to leave their situation, and we may never hear from them again. So for example, we might have a pastor or a family friend call and say, I have a sister or a cousin or someone in an abusive situation and I want them to get help. Can I just bring them to you? As much as we would love for that to be the case, that person, they may not have had a conversation with them to even see if they were ready to leave their situation. And like I said, we may never hear from them again. So when we receive intake calls, again, typically during this calm, tension building to incident phase in the cycle of abuse, we get their information. And then if we have space available, we give them directions to get to the shelter, do an intake to get their basic information. And then that's when they get set up with the case manager to assess their resources and their needs. So that's what a little tiny snapshot of the start of shelter life looks like. And this cycle of abuse is how those characteristics on the previous slide from that power and control wheel typically play out. So how do we respond with someone that has experienced abuse? I love this definition of trauma-informed care, which is a strengths-based framework that is grounded in understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma that emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, and that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. One of the reasons I really like this definition is because it includes both providers and survivors. I'm pretty sure all of our staff are in some form of therapy, which is extremely helpful. And in my counseling program, they taught us every good counselor has a counselor. And I would apply that to anybody that is doing some kind of social service to people that are in need. Is the best social service providers are in some way, shape, or form getting their own therapy, have their own self-care tools. And so before going into the field, you can practice this sort of care on yourself, and it affects the kind of care that you offer to other people as well. Another indicator in this definition that I really love is that there's physical, psychological, and emotional safety, which again, we'll talk about actually here in a couple slides, but providing that safety while keeping the individual's trauma in mind is what trauma-informed care is. So you can provide a safe environment, but not be considerate of what someone has experienced, and therefore actually end up doing more harm than good. And the other element of trauma-informed care is that you're rebuilding, as the end of the definition says, a sense of control and empowerment. So in an abusive situation, that sense of control, the sense of empowerment has been stripped away. And I can't tell you how many times I've had a guest sit in my office, and one of two things happens, at least physically. They come in my office and they're like, oh, Jess, I feel terrible. I don't know why I'm sick all of a sudden. Or they're like, I feel on top of the world. I'm going to start doing all of my goals, getting a job and doing all these things. The reason for that is our bodies physically store trauma. And so in those situations where abuse is taking place, our body is in survival mode. So it's not going to tell you that you have a cold. It's not going to tell you that you might have the flu. And because you're typically more focused on the situation at hand, or if you're a mom, you're more focused on your children or making sure that your abuser's okay so that they don't keep abusing you. There is an entire process of self-neglect that is happening. So when someone comes into a safe environment, their body's able to say, whew, girl, you've had this cough for like 3 months now. You might want to get that checked out. Or maybe they've been sick and in that state of survival mode, come to a safe environment and their body's like, whew, I can breathe, and actually starts to feel better. So whenever they're starting to go through that process, making sure that they remember, hey, you have the ability to go to your doctor's appointments and not be abused for it. You have the ability to make these different decisions on your own and the repercussions not be negative against you in any way. So trauma-informed care involves all of these components in making sure that we're providing the best care possible. This also looks like asking what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. The difference is that one allows for the survivor to tell their story while the other identifies them solely based on the outcome of their situation. So if I'm asking a survivor, what's wrong with you? They might have trauma. They might have various injuries and illnesses. They might have certain triggers that were a result of the abuse that they experienced. So to say what's wrong with you is to identify them as the embodiment of the abuse that they've gone through. Versus what happened to you, they have the autonomy to be able to say, this is what happened to me. And it also respects the fact that they are a human being that deserves dignity and respect. So they are not defined solely by the abuse they experienced or the repercussions of it. And this question also is useful really in any conversation with anyone that's experiencing a hard time, right? We may be talking to someone who might have just had a death in the family and we don't know that. And instead of saying, what's wrong with you? Why do you look so sad? It looks like your dog died. Well, actually, instead of, hey, what happened to you? Is there anything that I can do for you? And it gives that person the ability to share what they do want to share, what they don't want to share, which in our setting as a shelter can sometimes get a little tricky because as trust is beginning to build, we hear parts of someone's story and they might share that they're, in a domestic violence situation. But then over time, we might actually find out that certain elements of their story indicate that they've experienced sex trafficking, which is a whole other can of worms in and of itself. But making sure that we're presenting a space for survivors to share their story is essential in the care that we provide. So trauma-informed care asks what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. And so what can this look like very practically? So whether or not you are in a shelter setting, working directly with domestic violence survivors, or if you're just working with individuals who have experienced trauma, this may include children, which a lot of times we, as Oklahomans, we're mandated reporters. And so when we get those intake calls and we have information and children are present, we do have to make reports. So even including children, these are just some really practical ways that I pulled together as a case manager in the work that we've done with domestic violence survivors that you guys can take away, kind of put in your back pocket and go, hey, I remember that one presentation that this girl did a few months ago or a few years ago, and this is something that can be helpful in the work that you guys will end up doing. Is one, never underestimate the impact of a safe physical environment. So I put offices on here because my guests would feel incredibly trapped that I'm working with if their back is to an exit or there is a blockade to the exit, right? If at any point in time who I'm working with is maybe triggered, which has happened before, they might be talking about their situation and become so overwhelmed that they might have a panic attack in my office. They need to be able to have a clear shot to the exit. That in and of itself is a small way we can provide a safe environment for our guests. Sometimes that might look like on intake, if we find out information that in turn may be triggering for them. So being around men is difficult. We can't control the fact that we may have a maintenance guy that comes and fix our ice machine. So a part of making a safe environment is announcing on the intercom, hey, we're going to have a male in the building in the kitchen with the ice machine. So that's ensuring a safe environment. But very practically, again, how can I make my physical space more safe and trauma informed for the people that I'm working with? Secondly, avoid comparing or imposing your personal capabilities or assumptions. In missions training at school, when I was doing missions work, they taught us not to blue light someone else's experience. And so that was originated from Kmart. Used to have what was called the blue light special, where the items that were discounted had this blue light flashing around it, right? So we don't ever want to blue light, or in other words, discount someone else's experiences. So someone who may have 5 kids and has never worked a day in their life because their abuser may have been the primary financial provider, we can't look at them and go and say, you've been here for 2 weeks, why haven't you gotten a job yet? If I were in your situation, I would have been able to get a job. We have no idea what we would do in these different situations unless we've actually experienced it. And even if we have, a commonality with all of our guests is they have experienced some kind of abuse, but every single one of them responds to it differently. So being mindful of the fact that every person is going to respond to what they have experienced in different ways, and we have to cater the care and services that we provide to their individual experiences. Which leads to my third point of surrender your idea of progress. So if you are at an agency where progress is measured, that could be at a counseling agency, it could be at a domestic violence shelter, maybe there's billing involved, so you have to chart certain ways, that's one thing. But if going back to the guest that has 5 kids, may have never worked a day in their lives, and we're like, it's 2 weeks in, why haven't you gotten a job yet? In what ways are you creating a structure in your mind that impose your idea of progress on the person that you're working with? And so outside of the formalities of whatever agency that you may be at, again, how can we take the care that we're offering to the people that we're providing services for and cater it to their individual experiences, rather than assuming, well, based on my idea of progress or success, you are no longer successful. As a shelter, we honor the autonomy and the choices of the guests that we work with. And even though it's scary sometimes, if the guest comes and they stay with us for 12 hours, so they literally walked in the door, slept in their bed, left the next day, we are thankful for those 12 hours because it was 12 hours that they were out of their abusive situation. In turn, we have guests that come in, they stay with us for maybe 7 months, and they do end up getting a job. They end up getting their own transportation and their own housing, but neither one is more successful than the other because each individual has valid experiences that define how they view the world, how they view their experiences, and how they respond to them that vary from person to person. So just wanted to share those 3 things as just really practical back pocket things to pull out later as you may be working with survivors of domestic violence, or really anyone who has experienced trauma in the line of care that you guys may end up in the future. You guys can take a picture on your phone of this, screenshot on your laptop, that these are local resources in the Oklahoma area that serve survivors of domestic violence. I know I took an intro to social work class, and a part of that class, our professor had us pull together community resources, and lo and behold, ended up being really helpful coming into this job. And so just even knowing on a personal level or as social workers in the future, what the different area of resources are wherever you may end up is super helpful, because even if your agency where you're at doesn't offer domestic violence services directly, knowing where those services are can only be to the benefit of the people that you are working with. So I tried to watch my time, like off to the side here, but I wanted to give space for any questions about anything that I just shared.
This is kind of what you were saying, where you were saying like, we as social workers also need to have a therapist or a counselor to help us just kind of process the information that comes in and stuff, or the issues from others. Just out of curiosity, where did you find someone to be a therapist? Was it just a general one that you've worked with in the past? Was it someone that you feel comfortable that you can talk to, who's a friend as well? Just basically, what are some resources for us who also need help sometimes?
Absolutely. So my personal journey with therapy is kind of all over the place. I always recommend psychologytoday.com. You can put all kinds of filters on that search engine based on distance, based on insurance, based on specialty. and it narrows down therapists in your area. So that's psychologytoday.com. Fortunately, the Spring is able to offer a therapy option for all of our staff. So depending on where you end up in the future, your employer may offer a counseling service directly. As far as personal relationships, something that's very difficult but also very humbling about this job is that because of confidentiality, I can't talk about the different experiences that I come across. And on top of that, I believe there's a grace for social service providers to be in the roles that we're in. And not everybody has that grace. So I don't even want to assume that a friend or a family member can handle information that I'm sharing with them, because then I might indirectly induce some kind of secondhand trauma, right? So I would always encourage that unless you know someone who is also in the field on a personal level, to just, for me, in my experiences, I have found more fruit in keeping that information with professionals. And also, I actually don't talk a lot about work and therapy. I really deal with my own stuff. If something from work comes up, that's one thing. But I've noticed that the healthier I am, I absorb and process things differently that happen at work. So it's kind of twofold. Sometimes you'll talk about work stuff, and then in the event that you don't, doing that self-work is just as beneficial to the work that you do. So I hope that answered your question.
Definitely, because just with everything, I am looking for someone to talk to too. It's just, I kind of am in this part where it's like, I don't know what I can really look for. Like, I have a broad subject of things. So I think the Psychology Today will help, just because, like you said, I need to, I guess, filter things. But thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, Jessica. Joanna speaking. So my question for you is, I'd like to know your thoughts on, from a trauma-informed care perspective, about mothers who are deemed unable to protect their children when DHS gets involved, and if you think that perpetuates victim blaming, or what, you know, it just seems so complicated. And I know we have to be absolutely careful, especially when children are involved, but also it seems a little traumatizing additionally to the mother's experience.
My nonverbals are probably saying more than my words ever could, because that is probably one of the most frustrating aspects as an advocate. I had a situation a few years ago, actually around when I first started, where I was working with a guest and took them to court regarding a situation in which the harm to the child was because of the abusive situation that they were in. And while at court, I brought the guest to court, and the police arrested her in front of me, took her off to jail, and she is currently in prison to this day. And all of it was because, I can't give too many details, but the lack of response they deemed her to have was because transportation to a medical facility for their child was taken from them because of the abuser. Yet she was blamed for it. To this day, still causes me to fume. So my thoughts on it is that it's both systemic in how the legal and justice systems view mothers, and also not just in how they view mothers, but how they view the abusers or fathers of the children or caretakers of the children. And unfortunately, that can vary by state. And Oklahoma happens to be quite a conservative state that does just legislatively place more blame on the mom. And so what we do on our end, like, what do we do to that? Obviously, voting makes a difference when bills and certain things come up that on a local level, we can have some kind of influence in that area, but that also in any way, shape, or form, you can professionally advocate for who you're working with to be able to do so. And so for me, that looked like writing a very formal letter about that guest, getting insight from her attorney as to how that should be worded in terms of, this is how she's participating in this program. And even though I couldn't give my professional opinion on how she parented, because there'd be some bias in that, I could speak to the services and how she responded to them under our care at the shelter. And so really, it's just, how can I advocate for this person as best as I can, ethically and intentionally, to help their situation? The outcome, though, varies based on all the other factors involved that are very frustrating. So did that answer your question?
It did, and I have to say I'm in a similar situation where just certain things can I feel a little outraged. I didn't know that was a part of the process, and I was very shocked to find out. And I think, you know, just hearing from you on different things, how we can continue advocating is really important. And I guess just to follow up to that, when would you suggest that seeking an attorney's help would be? Like, when in the process does someone come to that realization, oh, an attorney might be necessary?
Excuse me, in my experience, I would say as soon as possible, and it also depends on the case itself. So in this situation, she did require an attorney that was bilingual, and we were able to find that service through Catholic Charities. And so it truly depends on the situation, because I would say it's more rare than it is common that we have a guest that comes in the door with a legal case already in process, determining whether or not she's a fit mother or has failure to protect or something like that. It's actually really rare, but when it happens, sometimes they have legal services in place, and if they don't, I'd always encourage getting it as soon as possible.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Jessica, I just have a question. You know, I would like just a simple maybe tip about it. In these cases of domestic violence, not always is the women the victim and the abuser is the male. So when you have a case, you know, where both of them are in this situation, and there is, you know, a past experience of trauma, you know, in the female, in the wife, how do you? Did you hear me?
Now I can. You're about to ask your actual question. How do you, and then it like cut off.
Oh, how do you, sorry, how do you deal with this? How is your, what is your approach, you know, in order to help them?
So,
you know, if it's, I don't know.
If the abuse is both
if
ways.
I am making, yes. Like if it's the mama or the wife that has the, you know, the background of being, you know, in many trauma situations since her childhood, and it's actually the one that is anger and start the physical interaction. What will be your approach with this?
So if I'm understanding correctly, if again, either person is the abuser. So if the woman's also abusive, just like the other partner in the relationship. Okay. So it is possible that that's the case. I did a whole research paper on female abusers. We as advocates are working with the information that's in front of us. So when a guest comes in the door and they're saying they are a victim of abuse, we are working with that information. Sometimes in groups, especially when we talk about assertive communication, boundaries, healthy relationships, it will come out, it could, that they're like, oh, I was also abusive as well. So when we get that information, we go, okay, tell us what your thoughts are on that. Did that come from a place of, like you were saying, the trauma and the experiences that you've had, and you had no other way of responding in that situation? And it's really working with that individual on a case-by-case basis. So we don't respond from a place of condemnation or, wow, I can't believe you were also an abuser, because typically, and we see this a lot actually with sex trafficking, from a place of survival, those that are trafficked sometimes become the trafficker. And the same goes with domestic violence. Sometimes the person that was abused also can become an abuser, but it didn't start that way. And we never treat it as if it did. So I hope that answers your question, but we take the information as it comes and try to handle it with as much grace and also information to help them learn healthier ways of interacting in relationships than they had before.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? I'm looking at the time. I know we have someone else sharing too.
I did have a question. I know you mentioned that you were a faith-based organization, and for women that come in that aren't from any sort of religious background, have you found that's any sort of barrier for them being able to communicate, or is that something that comes up at all, like within your organization?
It honestly depends. We don't make anything mandatory because at minimum, the state with our certification, we offer voluntary services. So we can't make anyone engage in any of the faith-based activities that we provide. It really just depends. We have women that are open to it. I have worked with atheists, I've worked with Buddhists, and some have expressed like, hey, I'm not about this. And it's like, hey, that's okay. And then sometimes, which involves a process of trust, is we might have a guest that comes in that might profess like, oh, I do believe in these things too, because they might still be in a mentality that we are another possible abuser in terms of how do I keep myself safe in this situation? So maybe if I say I believe this, that I might get what I need. And sometimes over time, it's like saying, hey, we're here to help you with what you need, regardless of what you believe, because you're a human being worthy of all of these different things that you're in need of, right? And so it may be a barrier at times, but it just manifests itself in different ways. So some are resistant. Some may say, I believe this as a means of survival. And over time, that trust is built to where they understand, oh, I can get my needs met regardless. And then we have individuals that are open to it, but none of it is mandated or imposed upon in any way.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. That's just, I thought about it and just wanted to ask. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? I'm like scrolling through the faces, like since they're not all on one screen. Uh-oh, I can't hear you, Christy.
Is this the right information to get a hold of you and everything?
Yes, if you have any other questions or insight on anything I went over today, please feel free to reach out and I'd be more than happy to help.
Okay, awesome. If anyone needs that, go ahead and take a screenshot or whatever of it, and then we will go ahead and get Amber. I think I seen she's on here now. Just
Yes.
stay on time. So, but thank you so much, Jessica, for taking time to share with us. Okay, Amber, whenever you're ready.
So hi, I'm Amber May. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I wanted to be a little transparent first. The weather and my laptop have hated me this week. My laptop is actually in IT. And so I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't have any presentation available. I'm winging this on a cell phone. So I apologize that this is like a tad unprofessional. Please bear with me. I don't even have a script or anything because all of it got wiped. So I'll just start with a little about me. I'm a social worker through and through. I have my bachelor, master, and my LCSW, all in social work. And my background is primarily in mental health and victim advocacy. So I have done domestic violence work, sexual assault work, stalking, and I'm currently employed by the university. I work in the Gender and Equality Center, which serves all 3 campuses of OU. I'm the OU Advocates case manager. So I run kind of the day-to-day advocacy for victims. I'm over the helpline. If you're not familiar with that, that is 405-615-0013. So that is available to, again, all campuses. And it is run by mostly volunteers. So the volunteers who run the helpline are all staff in other capacities here on campus. They might work in IT, they might work in the food industry, housing, they might be a secretary, a janitor. They're not faculty, they are staff. And then they volunteer to be a part of the OU Advocate team. I typically have about 30 volunteers. Right now I'm down to about 12. So if you are a staff and are interested, come talk to me. We would love to have more on our team. And so how we operate is a little bit of, let me back up a little bit. I appreciate the insight that Jessica gave you all on domestic violence, because I think that really helps to give a little bit of background into how OU Advocates helps. Because most people, particularly women, and again, I won't in any way insinuate that victims are always women or the perpetrators are always men, but that is typically what we see. Women in the community tend to know about community resources. So in Tulsa, that might be DIVIS, it might be the Spring, it might be the Family Justice Center. In Oklahoma City, that might be, excuse me, that might be the YWCA, Palomar, the Family Justice Center here in Oklahoma City. In Norman, that tends to be the Women's Resource Center. But what we find is that students on campuses, particularly baby adults, right? So 18, 19, 20-year-olds, living on their own for the first time, living on their own might be dorms. We find that they don't know their community resources as well. And so OU Advocates tends to be kind of that stepping stone between student needs and community resources. So in some ways we operate much the same. I'm doing advocacy, I'm doing resources, referrals, but in some ways it's a lot different, right? I don't have a shelter that I'm relying on the community resources for shelter. I'm relying on the community resources for forensic exams, and things like that. But I do, as OU Advocates, we do, help with resources and referrals for counseling services. We do a lot of Title IX work. If you're not familiar with Title IX, I would highly encourage you find out a little bit about it. And I'm happy to send you all some information about Title IX and how that process benefits and sometimes doesn't benefit victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking. Let's see, where was I? So sorry, without a script, I'm just like winging this. So each campus, I will say each campus tends to have its own unique needs because they have their own unique populations, right? So Norman campus tends to be that 18 to 22, primarily utilizing OU Advocates. In those scenarios, it's much more about sexual assault. There's a lot of fraternity and sorority issues. There's a lot of stalking happening. On our Tulsa and HSC campuses, those tend to be more of the professionalized populations. That I think the average age for Tulsa is like 36 for a student. So those tend to be much more adultier situations. And on those campuses, we're looking at a lot more relationship violence, but also stalking. And so it does differ. And I don't know, I think most of you are on Tulsa campus. Is that right? Heads, yes. Okay. So, utilizing OU Advocates can look like VPO assistance, victim protective order. It can look like going to the police department. It can look like involving Title IX or sexual misconduct. It can look like academic support. We do a lot of academic support. So that can often looks like a letter to the dean or to their professors that does not say that they're working with us. It usually comes from student affairs. So it's much more generalized. But it just indicates that student affairs staff are working with this student and would like some leniency, some patience. Maybe it's because of absences. Maybe it's because they were assaulted and were not able to concentrate on their exam. And so they just didn't go. That's actually happening a lot right now. I've gotten 3 calls this week from Norman students who were just like, hey, something happened last week and I thought I could do my midterm. Turns out I couldn't. So, you know, one of the ways that we assist students is with these academic notifications. We utilize a lot of on-campus resources if possible. So counseling on the Norman campus, that's the University Counseling Center at Goddard. I know there's some resources on Tulsa and HSC campuses for counseling as well. If you're on the Tulsa campus, Lauren Condry in Student Affairs is our advocate on that campus. After hours, we do utilize DIVIS as the helpline. And, oh, sorry, I'm being distracted by chats and it's on a cell phone. So it's like really hard to navigate. So I kind of feel like I'm rambling. Does anyone have any questions about kind of what OU Advocates is for, what we do, who operates? No? We work pretty closely with the gender-based violence prevention programs. So if you're familiar with being a freshman at OU at all, then you know that freshmen are required to do Step In, Speak Out, which is the gender-based violence prevention training during your freshman year. We coordinate a lot of trainings with fraternities and sororities, lots of trainings with student organizations, Title IX, sexual misconduct, OUPD. Again, we're 24/7, so that number works. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., Christmas Day, Thanksgiving Day, Fridays, whatever. I'm also available via email all the time, ambermay@ou.edu. It's a super simple email address. You can also email the GEC at ou.edu if you need to request a Zoom meeting with any of our staff. All of our staff are trained to be OU advocates. I'm the only staff advocate that's all I do, but the rest of the staff also are volunteers as well. And then just as an aside for social work students, because I'm a social worker through and through, I will say, you know, when I was going through my bachelor and my master's program, I didn't think that at the time, certainly could be different now, that we received enough information about domestic violence in particular. And so if that is still true, then I would highly encourage you to do some Google researching for trainings, because there are hundreds of free trainings, webinars that are from all over the United States. They're all great information. 9/10 of all domestic violence trainings are free. And so I just really would encourage you to take that, because no matter what sector you go into in social work, if you're going to be a case manager at a mental health center, if you're going to be a therapist, if you're going to be doing hospital work, it doesn't matter which area you're going into, you're going to find relationship violence, stalking, sexual assault to be a part of your work. And it really would behoove you to know some of those issues that particularly women face, but that all people face about relationship violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So does anyone have any questions? Just scrolling through. Okay, well then I will just be quiet.
Thank you so much, Amber, for providing us with that information. Both of you guys, we appreciate both speakers so much. This is our second SWSA meeting, and this was a much better turnout than the first one. So I think we're all happy about that. These are what our SWA meetings will be like. Each month we'll have a different speaker talking about some different things or areas of social work. So just be watching out for those emails. Christy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are allotted 10 to be able to count one of these meetings as a practicum hour. Is that right? just 10 of them. And it has to be okayed by supervisor or liaison. I think that's right. We can email out the correct answer to that. But I know that as long as it's okay, it can count towards the practicum hours. So I know that's pretty great. So just be watching out for our emails. We love to have you guys join. And if you guys don't have any more remarks or like suggestions, then we can conclude. Good.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Brittany.